And also, just a point, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available afterwards. Now, by way of introduction, to me, I'm Kent Honl, arborologist at Rainbow Tree Companies. Arborologist is basically a term we've created ourselves here to describe the arborist who's behind the scenes supporting the other arborists who are out doing the practice in the field. And I take care of technical information and offer up training, that kind of thing. I'm a board certified master arborist since 2007. I've worked with Rainbow Tree Care in our local market in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area since 1994. I'm also an adjunct faculty in arboriculture at Hennepin Technical College in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. The intended outcomes for today, we want to talk about understanding soil compaction and soil oxygen relationship, the importance of that, and how to recognize symptoms in a tree that are soil-related problems. That's very common. And looking at root enhancements to improve tree health. We'll look at the tools available to help improve soil conditions, how to improve root growth in a changed soil environment, and how to talk to your client about this, how to sell soil management services. So just getting started with the basic issue of soils. What do trees get from soils? We all know that they get structural support. Soil is what holds them up. They're not floating in midair. And obviously they get nutrients from soil too, and that's where trees absorb water from, is from the ground. And they get oxygen from soils too. Most of the time we don't think of that, but trees get oxygen for the root system from the soil profile. And as I say, we don't typically think of that, the oxygen being necessary to the roots, but I'll get more into detail in that when I go into some features about tree physiology. But just strictly speaking, this is almost like on the level of hydroponics, you know, that structural support, nutrients, water, you know, you can grow things just in basically crushed rock and provide nutrients to it through water. But soil goes much beyond that, as I'll dive into greater detail. But just from a purely mechanical standpoint, this is what trees get from soils. And I like to include this point that's quite a bit overlooked by arborists and anyone who works with growing things, that we think soils are so important because that's where nutrients come from that lead to the mass of the tree. You know, you have to have nitrogen, you have to have all these different things that come from the soil to build a tree, but in reality, trees are mostly made of thin air. That's kind of just a rhetorical point, but it's also to point out that there's a great importance. The atmosphere interaction with the soil is hugely important, often overlooked, and the fact that more than 99% of the mass of a tree comes from the carbon it extracts from the atmosphere. So mostly trees are made up out of thin air. It's a pretty miraculous thing that a tree seed is like a little package that lands on the soil, and it has a blueprint in it to open itself up and build a tower covered with solar panels that can build itself out of thin air and then keep making copies of itself more or less in perpetuity, as long as the conditions allow for that. And if we're looking at how that happens, it's just two flip sides of one activity: photosynthesis and respiration. And really that comes down to what the meaning of life is. You know, we're talking about soil management today, but you get some philosophy in today's webinar too, and get to learn the meaning of life. It's all energy capture and energy release. No matter what kind of organism you are, if you're a tree or a human, if you're not capturing more energy than it takes you to survive, then you're not in the game of life anymore. And everything is about how you capture energy and how you release it too, and hopefully you're not releasing more than you capture. It all basically boils down to photosynthesis. Again, I'd mentioned atmospheric carbon combined with water and energy of sunlight captured by a leaf on a tree. Then with photosynthesis you end up with glucose or stored energy and oxygen that's released. That's what gives us the oxygen that we can breathe. So if you go to the right side there for respiration. We normally think of respiration as just breathing into our lungs, and that's more or less true. Respiration is breathing, but in the sense of chemistry, it has to do with how energy is used and released again to get work done of living, growing, surviving, that kind of thing. So you take that glucose that was created through photosynthesis and combine it with oxygen, then you can release carbon dioxide and water and energy. That energy can be used to grow roots in trees. It can be used if you're doing some physical work. You know, if we put this into context, like the tree that I pictured here, say it's a maple, and we collected maple sugar from it, put it on pancakes this morning, and then I rode my bike into the office today before this webinar. I used that glucose from the maple sugar combined with the oxygen I was breathing, and then I exhaled carbon dioxide and water vapor, and I got all hot and sweated up on the bike ride. That was the energy release. So then the trees took that CO2 that I exhaled along the bike trail, and they're incorporating that back into new growth again, if everything is working properly in the conditions that they have to live in. I like to point this out too with classes, that you can see this pairing of a tree, the upward-outward branching organism that gives off oxygen, is kind of like the perfect mirror to the downward-inward branching lung pattern that we have, that takes in that oxygen and gives off the CO2. So they're the perfect complementarity to each other. So one provides what the other needs, and they have a similar branching pattern. I just find that fascinating, kind of a unity of life aspect that's out there. And that's why I'm an arborist. I'm just geeking out about this kind of stuff all the time. But basically, you have to account for both of these things in a tree. That trees don't just photosynthesize. We might think trees have it great. They don't have to commute to a job and buy groceries and stuff. They just stand there and collect energy from the sun. But trees respire too, and if they don't have the right soil conditions, they don't have the conditions to respire. Think about where tree roots actually are. They're in the top 10 to 12 inches of the soil where that oxygen is, because roots in their growth, they require energy to do that, and that's respiration. That requires the use of that glucose, some measure of that. And the picture that I have posted here, it's not just some graphic that somebody drew, it's an actual excavation of a tree to show the reality of this. It's basically like a big widespread mat. It's not like the typical thing you learn in grade school where the roots of a tree mirror the top and they go as deep as the crown goes high. Really, it doesn't work that way, because if roots need oxygen to do their activities, to grow and absorb nutrients, all that kind of thing, the further you get away from the air, the atmosphere, there's less and less oxygen available. You know, it makes sense, the most oxygen is in the upper margin of the soil. So that's where tree roots are going to grow. And they tend to go upwards of 2 to 4 times the width of the drip line, or where the edge of the canopy extends out into the air. Now, where did trees evolve? Is typically forest settings, and all the trees that we use for our urban plantings, their progenitors are out in the forest. And looking at the forest soil is very informative as to what kind of conditions they like to grow in. You've got very clearly marked profiles or layers in forest soils, starting from the top with the O horizon. It just means the loose, partly decayed organic matter, the duff, the twigs, leaves that drop annually and cover the soil surface and decay and release nutrients into that A horizon, where the minerals get mixed with humus, where the organic matter gets decomposed, and as you go down through further levels, the soaking of precipitation over time develops these layers. And an interesting point also is we think of soil as the solid medium where tree roots are growing. But really, look at that pie chart to the left or to the right on the slide. Only 50% of a soil in an ideal setting is solid material. The other 50% is airspace and space for water to be percolating in the soil or to be absorbed by tree roots. So that's what you would typically find in a forest soil. You would go into a forest that's undisturbed, and you could probably pretty easily dig up a sample of it because it's not compacted or crushed, and there's a lot of moist space in there and a lot of air pockets. But as arborists, we're not really dealing with that ideal forest soil most of the time. We're dealing with urban conditions, or it's a far different story. We've got greatly reduced conditions for that root function and health because of the compaction and the low organic matter. That gets hauled away during the development of a site, or you've got this picture like with the linden. It looks like a telephone pole the way it was planted. There's the rope still coiled around it from the ball and burlap, those dark rocks that are heaped over it as a mulch, and I can pretty much guarantee there's a black plastic liner under that too. So that zero oxygen is getting to that root system that's there, and it's planted too deep as well. One point I bring up typically with those dark rocks, if you find those, go out on a July day and pick one up. You can barely hold it if that's been in the sun. They heat up so much. So that localized heat then will desiccate the soil and make it far more heat stressed and drought stressed than it would have been otherwise. And what I've typically done many times, I pick up one of these big black chunky rocks and hand it to the client, and they feel it right away, and they just drop that thing, and I say, yeah, that's what your tree roots are trying to grow in. It's not really a good environment for roots to survive, so I suggest we do some changes to that area and just make it a much better condition for the tree. So what makes the urban soil a departure from the ideal? The compaction, for one thing. It reduces the pore space between soil particles. And really those tree roots, the root hairs, we call them root hairs because they are literally as fine as the hairs on your head, and they're not, strictly speaking, growing in the soil. They're growing in the pore spaces between the soil particles. And if that gets crushed out, there's just physically no way that those roots can penetrate there. Then there's no oxygen able to percolate in there so that the roots can refire and grow and do all their functions. And there's not water that can move into there either, just to keep the rest of the tree functioning. Because remember back to the slide with photosynthesis, water is one of the elements needed for photosynthesis to take place. So if you have water stress, less energy is being captured and the whole physiology of the tree is reduced. So this is all about accounting for the tree's ability to do everything it's supposed to do, respire and photosynthesize. Now, low organic matter too, maybe that doesn't sound like a big deal, but you compare, contrast the urban soil, like the brand new suburban developed house. I remember the part of town where I worked for 15 years, you typically had a situation where you had a compacted clay subsoil left behind after the builder came and stripped off all the topsoil and stockpiled it, maybe gave them an inch back over the subsoil, and then they roll sod over it, and people try to plant trees in that, and it just doesn't work. If you don't have that nice O horizon where roots can penetrate and it's full of nutrients and water space, it just is not really, it's essentially trying to plant a tree in a clay pot if you try to put a tree in the front yard of this home pictured here. Well, if we step back from that and look at what are the main properties of soils that we can analyze or describe or work with, it basically falls into these three areas: chemical, physical properties, and biological properties. And each one of those is important in its own way, and we can work with that in particular ways too with tools we have available. Moving to the first on the list is chemical properties. It's just like the name implies, straight up elements, like the macronutrients as they're typically called, the things used in large amounts that you typically see in supplemental fertilizers like the NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Those are chemical properties. Secondary nutrients, they're still used in large amounts but commonly available. Typically in soils there's enough calcium and magnesium. Sometimes sulfur gets added, but we'll get into more detail about that later. And very important, but needed only in very small amounts, are the micronutrients, especially the manganese and iron. If those are deficient, you notice it right away with leaf yellowing and other kinds of symptoms. But just purely on a chemistry level, you can list off all these nutrients that are essential to plant growth. And another chemical feature in soils is the pH. The level of acidity or alkalinity in the soil has a huge influence over the availability of these nutrients. And typically, if you have a soil pH between 6.2 and 7.3, that cuts a swath through this chart that shows where do you hit all those bars that are showed there in the most optimum range. As you move towards 7.5 and above, there's a bunch of these things like iron, manganese that become less available. Sulfur is still pretty good, potassium is still pretty good, but if you want the widest range of availability of all these things, aim for 6.2 to 7.3 range. And most of the soil tests that I brought back from the territory I worked were very alkaline, and so it reflected a lot with iron and manganese deficiencies. But here's a soil test. So I mentioned soil tests. This is just a measure of soil chemistry alone. Very important information, but this is just a chemistry report basically. If you look at the nice little smiley or frowning faces there, the organic matter 0.8%, very low. It would be great to have that. Thinking back to that idealized forest soil slide, we had 5% organic matter in there. 5% would be great. I'd be happy with 3 even. Then phosphorus, that looks plenty good. The pH though, see where the red arrow is, 7.3, we're getting on the high end of ideal, but still really if I had soil test at 7.3, I'd be pretty happy because I've seen a lot of them at. Then I like it when a soil test comes back and we've got these sulfur, zinc, manganese, iron, the micronutrients listed on there as well. Now this is typical Minnesota. We've got the iron range here in the northern part of the state, and we tend to have high iron where the little smiley face is. But just to the left of that, manganese listed very low, pretty typical for our area. So this kind of will reflect a pattern of how the trees will behave on the sites and the symptoms we'll get. But again, this is just purely on the soil chemistry level. There's also physical properties of soils. The texture is a main one. It's either clay or silt or sand. No soil is purely one or the other. It's not very typical that you have all clay or all silt, but usually there's some kind of mixture, and that triangular chart gives you kind of a readout of if you've got varying percentages of different things, and you read where your soil lands in that chart. Soil texture just has to do with what is the nature of the particles that make up the soil. Then structure has to do with how do those particles aggregate into larger chunks. Do they form into columns or blocks, or does it just sort of aggregate into these granular chunks? Or if it's clay, it might arrange itself into platey, kind of layers, more or less like that. So the physical properties of soils have a lot to do with it reflects back to the chemistry of soils. Like if it's a lot of clay, it'll hold nutrients and water, but it won't have much ability to drain, or won't have as much oxygen penetration in there. If it's more sand, it'll drain very well and have lots of oxygen, but it won't hold nutrients very well. So each chemical, physical, biological can have an influence on each other. We just break them out to sort of focus on particular aspects to work with. Biological properties of soils, I feel like almost any one of these slides I could blow up into a webinar all its own, and I'm kind of just breezing through, to keep the outline going. But biological properties of soils are of huge importance, because without the bacteria and fungi in soils, then there's not the decomposition of organic matter, that leaf litter, that breaks it down into nutrients that tree roots can use. Without creatures like earthworms or burrowing animals introducing oxygen, then there's less oxygen for tree roots to grow. And fungi are not just decay fungi or pathogenic fungi. We tend to think of fungi as the bad guys, but really there are beneficial fungi. Probably most arborists by now have heard of mycorrhizae, that they're fungi that adhere onto root hairs and hugely expand the surface area for the feeding of nutrients. And the mycorrhizae then increase the uptake of phosphorus, other minerals, and water, and the tree gives back some of that stored energy, glucose, to the fungus. So they have a symbiosis going on. But if you don't have all the other things that work for tree roots, you won't have the conditions for mycorrhizae either. If the soil is too compacted or there's not enough organic matter to support the other life forms, the biological properties of soils are of huge, huge importance. Now, if we bring it out of the theoretical into the practical, again, I'll have to admit, this is a rhetorical question. How many arborists out there deal with these situations? You got the new homes and the new landscapes, trees lacking vigor, trees with root issues like girdling roots, or mature trees in a limited root area. Maybe it's hemmed in between a curb of a street and a sidewalk or other hardscapes. Or you're starting to see nutrient deficiencies like chlorosis, that kind of thing. Well, it's pretty much everybody. It's not like any arborist I've ever talked to says, well, no, we don't really have that in my area. If you're arborist, you're dealing with urban conditions, you probably have all these on any given day. And symptoms of soil-related tree problems, if you've got tip dieback, fall color starting early, way before you'd expect it, that's not a good sign. Chlorosis or leaf yellowing, just a general decline, the tree is not performing well. Or if you think back to that linden I showed earlier, it looks like a telephone pole going into the ground. It doesn't have a nice root flare. All those are considered soil-related problems. And really, when you think of it, most tree problems are soil-related. If we look at that oak tree in front of the house up on the left here, if you start looking at it like, oh, that tip dieback, it must have maybe oak wilt or two-line chestnut borer. And I've fallen into this trap too of already thinking ahead the steps to the heroic measures I'm going to take to save that tree with injections and insecticides and that kind of thing, which is fine, but you really need to start your diagnostics and your workup on that tree from the ground level up. Like, what led to the tree becoming attractive to the pest in the first place? Or was there enough, was it mower damage around the base of the tree where none of your treatments will get uptake into that tree? So start from the ground up, and you maybe are led in a more accurate direction of where you can deal with the problem or not. So always keep that in mind. And I'm kind of a broken record for this concept of the disease triangle. I put this into my other webinars I've done: foliar, fungus management, pollinator, preservation for arborists. I always go back to this disease triangle as a very simple but powerful IPM concept that basically says if you've got a host tree in a particular environment, there's not a disease or an insect that just kind of exists independently of its own. It has to have a host and an environment in which that condition can arise. That take out any one of these corners and the whole condition doesn't exist. And it sounds pretty basic, but when you change it over like this, how can you intervene as a practitioner? That there's typically, as I was saying, you see that tip dieback in an oak or something. Our tendency is to go sort of in our got a problem, take a pill approach to our problems in society. What kills that bug? What bug is it and what kills it? That's going immediately to the control the pathogen corner there. But if you're doing that, you maybe overlook things within the host or the environment that led to that condition arising in the first place, and you're actually sacrificing a lot of power you have in that situation to change the conditions to reduce the virulence of that pest, and losing opportunity for the client to be enrolled as an ally on your side to do what they can with the cultural practices, where if they're not messing it up when you drive away and then their sprinkler system runs every other day and it's flooding the soil, you need to have that complete conversation with the customer about how all this works too, with the host, the environment, the pathogen relationship. So there's a lot of tools as an arborist that you have in here with changing or modifying the host or modifying the environment, and that's the crux of the rest of what we'll talk about here is soil modification tools and other kinds of things that could be an adjunct with that. So if we're just looking purely at that chemistry level of soil properties, the soil environment, you can always do fertilization, soil injected fertilizer. We do quite a lot of that. We have a standard formula that we set up at Rainbow Tree for the predominant results from the soil tests that we get in our area. We know that we tend to have high pH soils and it's low in potassium. I've seen a lot of low manganese in our area typically. So we'll just build a kind of a standard formula that works for that. We can add custom amendments to that as needed. If it's a really high pH, then add extra sulfur, that kind of thing. But again, it's a good thing to do, but you're only working on the chemistry level of that soil in that localized area. That's not doing anything to moderate the compaction that's probably there. That's typical of urban soils. So while it's a good thing, it's only modifying one little element in the disease triangle or in the soil properties that you're talking about. If you bring it to the realm of cultural practices and something that's good for trees, mulch, that's another thing. Maybe I'm a broken record for mulching, but it's just good on a lot of different fronts. It regulates the soil moisture and temperature, so you're not going through swings of wet, dry, hot, cold. So roots will have a much better time of growing in that. And competition with turf grass is reduced. That's an obvious one. And you keep those darn mowers and weed whips at bay. I was guilty of it, of seeing an oak tree with that tip die back, and I'm already thinking how I'm going to save this tree, and I'm going to put the diameter tape on there so I know the dosage for the measurements. And I look down, and 90% of that root flare was girdled from weed whips. So that changed from a heroic saving of that tree to a removal bid. It could have been avoided by having mulch around the base of that tree, and there would be about a 40-inch diameter bur oak still alive today. But that's not always the case. So mulch is a good thing that way. It also recycles urban wood waste, which, tree services, we've got loads and loads of that chips around. But basically, over the long term, mulch tends to replicate a forest soil the longer it stays on that surface. The soil becomes less compacted as earthworms live in there and move back and forth through the soil profile. As the mulch decays, you tend more towards an acidic balance that keeps the nutrients more available. In our locality where we have alkaline soils, more acidity is always welcome. There are certainly other parts of the country where you wouldn't welcome more acidity, but it's not like this is going to skew it to the point where you get toxic levels of acidity. It's just an overall better environment for tree roots. The evidence is shown in this picture by George Watson from the Morton Arboretum, where they did studies with cores that were placed into soils under trees with turf grass under the crown, and really just a way to kind of passively introduce organic matter. Okay. Yeah, so mulch is really just a way to passively introduce organic matter, but if there are ways as arborists, practitioners, we can more directly introduce organic matter, it's a good thing because it improves the soil properties in all three of those areas that I outlined. Chemical, physical, and biological qualities of your soil improve when you have organic matter introduced in there. And remember, the ideal forest soil has maybe 5% organic matter, and the soil test that we saw had 0.8%, and that's pretty typical of soil tests I've seen. Well, it improves the chemistry of soils because organic matter has a lot of nutrients and compounds that can move into the soil. The physical properties of soil, they're kind of a fixed entity in the sense that if you have a sandy soil, you're not going to change the nature of sand. But once that organic matter starts to break down from the biological activity, then that soil can become more porous as the earthworms move through it, or it can become more aggregated if it's sand and the water holding capacity increases of that sandy soil. The biological stuff increases, of course, because there's just food sources for all the different organisms that break down chunky stuff like wood chips, twigs, leaf litter. The organic matter goes through whole stages of decomposition, starting with the macro level where there are insects and worms and things that eat it and break it down, and then bacteria further process it to the point where it's mineral. So really, again, organic matter, if you can get that into the soil, it'll improve all those areas of the soil that we described: chemical, physical, biological. What we do at Rainbow for this direct introduction of organic matter, we call it the root enhancement service, where we loosen a large volume of soil around the base of the tree with an air spade. Air spade is really just a tool using forced air that loosens up compacted soil. You can see that compressor, it's the same size compressor that's used to blow out sprinkler lines typically in the fall. But our application of it is a hose is hooked up to it with this air gun, and it forces air in between those pore spaces and fractures it up, loosens that. And it can also be used to stir in or incorporate organic matter. And we're really aiming at trying to get that forest soil condition back. What we would typically do in a situation where we've got a tree that looks like it needs some help, the starting point is just with a wire probe, try to estimate where that root flare depth is to see how deep we're going to have to excavate. Because sometimes if you have that telephone pole condition, maybe that flare is down there 6 or 8 or more inches even. So we start out with the consulting arborist on site, just inserting a wire probe to see if there's any way to kind of determine how much trouble we're in or how much we're going to have to try and excavate that situation. So if we determine that we can go further and we want to try to excavate that root collar, this is the primary reason we got the air spade probably 10, 12 years ago at least. Well, more than 10 years ago, the air spade has been around. But just for the purpose of extracting soil from around the base of trees without injuring roots in the process. Previous to the air spade, it had to be done by hand with a trowel and a whisk broom, and it was very laborious and nearly impossible to not get some injury to roots as you were digging around in there. And we find in our area at least that maples and lindens are the most prone to the stem girdling root problems. Then 90% of these are planted too deep, and when you've got the deep planting, that's where the stem girdling root formation gets started. And removing those roots is critical to enhance the survival. You know, when I had a client with a large property when we got the air spade, and I took it out myself personally and excavated about 25 of his trees in one day, and I'd agree with this. 90% of them are planted too deep, and they just look like a mess. It's just a tangle of roots around there. In the human planted trees, at least, if you did this to a tree in the forest, it would just look like spokes radiating out from a wheel. So after you do a root collar excavation and you're looking at this picture in front of you, and then you have some decisions to make. What are you going to do? Well, do you cut off all those things, or do you stop at a given percentage, or is it so bad that you just walk away? You know, there are cases where if you cut off all those girdling roots, then the tree often tilts or even blows down because they were also supporting the tree. So it is really a catch-22. The roots are girdling the tree, but they're also feeding into some part of the tree, and they're also supporting it. So, you know, you just kind of have to make a judgment call. I mean, maybe you say, to the crew, remove 30% of the worst ones you find, and then we wait and see what happens. Or if they're so embedded, it would damage the tree so much trying to dig them out that you'd probably cause the death of the tree. Every case is so different once you get that opened up. That's why we charge this, we do it as a staged thing and have a minimum $200 charge so that it's not all one package, and then the client says, well, it was too far gone to do anything to it, I'm not going to pay. No, they should at least have the agreement ahead of time so that they're willing to pay for the root collar exam as the first stage of it. And we don't really know what we're going to find until we get in there. It's exploratory surgery, more or less. And some of our arborists would say, well, our local urban forestry professor at the U just cuts off all the girdling roots. Why should you stop at a percentage? Well, he's also not accountable to clients who have trees blow over after you cut off all the roots. You know, he's a U of M guy. He can do whatever he wants in the name of research. We actually have to answer to clients and the results of the tree that happens after we do the stuff. So it might be even smartest just to walk away when you see it looks really bad in there. You can't save all of these. But if we are lucky and there's just a few girdling roots, you can cut them off. It doesn't endanger the stability of the tree, and you get there in time to really help it out by liberating it from that constriction. Then we go on to further stages of the root enhancement process. What we do is we offer 3 standard ring sizes, a 3 or a 5 or a 7-foot ring radius around the base of the tree. And the pricing for it will be set by the square footage within that ring, minus the root flare area. You know, if you look at the tree in the picture here, there's a root flare area there that eats up a bunch of the square footage, and that's probably that's looking like at least a 5-foot ring. So if you had a 5-foot ring around a new tree that was 4-inch diameter, there's a different square footage in that versus the square footage where you start from a root flare that's almost 4 feet spanning across and head out from there. But basically, 100 square feet will charge $525. 200 square feet is $750. It sounds like a lot, but you know, this is a pretty labor-intensive process, but it's doing something fundamental to change the living conditions of the tree and allow it to have airspace, organic matter mixed in, basically not just kind of continuing to put a Band-Aid on a situation by killing insects or spoon-feeding nutrients to it. This is like being a real practitioner trying to make a fundamental change on behalf of the tree. So yeah, it looks like it costs a bit, but you know, when you look at what we're doing and for the long term for the tree, it doesn't seem as bad then. So the root enhancement, you know, we do the root collar excavation, remove some girdling roots, then next stage is to remove the sod out to that given radius and work on the decompaction of the soil with the air spade. In sandier soils, it's easier to do, and clay soils, I've had a hard time getting below maybe 4 inches in the really bad stuff. And you'll see the operator here has the hard hat with the hearing protection and a face screen on too, because a lot of dirt gets blowing up or soil blows up, particles, and it makes a lot of noise. So you need PPE working with this too. And most people have a Tyvek suit because they come back just crusted in the soil that blows up and it's blowing all over the place. So after that soil gets decompacted, then we've got the stirring in of prescription organic matter and amendments. We've got 3 prescriptions that we apply, whether it's a new tree, an established tree, or a mature tree, bigger, older trees. So POM 1, 2, and 3 just means a prescription organic matter, 1, 2, or 3. And the difference between these are the levels of carbon-nitrogen ratio. That organic matter 1 has less than number 2, and that has less than number 3. The rationale being a mature tree, we don't want to push more new growth really with the nitrogen. And the way that we achieve these different ratios is by basically just mixing carbon, i.e. wood chips, in with a given volume of compost that we get. And we just get bulk compost from a local vendor that gets it from composting urban wood waste. At this time, you can also add in things like iron sulfate, manganese sulfate to reflect the results of your soil test. As I said, I typically have low manganese and high pH, so manganese sulfate is a really good one to hit that on both fronts to increase the manganese and lower the pH. So that's something that can be applied as a surface application and mixed in with the air spade with the organic matter. We're just recently starting to add in biochar as well, and here's another thing where I could do a whole half hour at least just on biochar, but basically it's a stabilized carbon form with a lot of surface area in it. It's charcoal mixed into the soil. The surface area in 1 gram of this stuff is larger than a football field, so the ability of this to hold on to water and nutrients and keep them available, to introduce porosity to clay soils, it has a lot of benefits. And as a stabilized organic matter form, it's not going to be just decomposed and used up readily. It'll stay there for the long term. So we finish up the root enhancement process by top dressing it and doing a thorough watering, because this will ease the stress, hopefully, of the drying of those root hairs. When you imagine tree roots living in that area and a lot of forced air going through there, it's going to desiccate those root hairs. So it's one of the trade-offs. You know, you need to sometimes do something a little disruptive to make a longer-term change that's for the better. But this is something that we do as a rule. And managing your client expectations is important in doing, well, any arboricultural process, but especially root enhancement, that you don't always end up saving the tree, and it's not going to bounce back in a day or two. This is a process that might often take years to complete, but you really have to clearly describe the aftercare to the client, just very emphatically let them know they need to water that tree. And they're going to maybe need some hand holding. You know, I've had that happen where, you know, visit the tree once a week for them if that's what it takes, but I have also never been one to overpromise. I try to aim low on the expectations so when the tree does recover, then you look like the hero. But if you overpromise and the tree declines, then you heal. So just avoid that kind of situation. Don't get too spooked from trying to save trees, but try to manage the client expectations very well along the process too. There are other uses of the air spade that we have. Daylighting is fairly common if we run into a situation where the company that marks the locations of utilities before we do stump grinding or vibratory plow lines for root graft disruptions, oak wilt, Dutch elm disease situations, we'll use the air spade to expose where those utilities are so we know exactly what we're dealing with, how close we can get or not with a stump grinder in certain situations. Or you can use it to cleanly expose root flares for injections. Injections with material like verdure. It's basically a chelated iron or manganese solution that you can macro-infuse to increase chlorophyll in trees that are chlorotic. By doing this, it gives you time to manage the soil conditions. If you're just doing this, it's kind of spoon-feeding a nutrient to help the chlorophyll production, which is critical so the tree can manufacture sugar. You know, you're accounting for photosynthetic ability. But then again, remember at the beginning we were talking about respiration is important too. If the tree is not able to have roots that can respire and do their full function, you're really not dealing with the long-term solution to the problem. With verdure, typically this can give you enough iron, say in a pin oak, to last 3 years, and that tree will start turning green right away. The following year it holds a nice green, and you might need to do it on a recurring basis, but along the way make sure you're managing those soil conditions too, so you're not just kind of down in the control the pathogen corner of that disease triangle. Strictly speaking, chlorosis is not a pathogen, but it's a condition, you know, but remember the whole system needs to change to account for the tree's full functions. Here's a slide of some results with verdure. In 2004, a pin oak looked pretty yellow, and they get to the color of a yield sign here in Minnesota, but with the help of some verdure, it got nice and green again. Maintained that with regular injections of verdure. Other options, plant growth managers. Cambostat has been very popular with our arborists here. There's been whole webinars just on this as well, but it's really great for stimulating root growth. Once you've done that preparation of a soil area for loosening it up and you want to increase root growth and other aspects of what Cambostat can deliver, triggers closing of stomata to keep up with transpiration. So the tree isn't transpiring so much water as aggressively. It's more conservative with the resources it has and protects the cells from dehydration. And this is all basically, it's a hormonal instruction to reduce the rate of crown growth, but allow that energy and budget it into other types of activities in the tree. And I think of it as a way of modifying the host. There's not often ways in that disease triangle of modifying the host, but this is one of them. You see an increase in chlorophyll with Cambostat. It's, you know, if the tree is not putting that typical energy into trying to grow a bigger crown, it can reduce that and reallocate that energy into other purposes. And darker green leaves is typical of this red oak 3 years after treatment. Looks much better on the right than it did on the left. Now, if you're using Cambostat to increase a tree's root mass, what point would there be to do it if the tree is planted in a compacted clay soil and you give it the impetus to grow more roots? Where are they going to grow? You know, do that air spade work first, then apply Cambostat. And one reason is the tree needs the space to grow the root into. The second reason is if you apply Cambostat first and then do the air spade, it's going to blow Cambostat all over the place and regulate plants that you don't want to regulate. So it's just a cleaner process to do your air spade work and then apply Cambostat. There are other opportunities too, as long as you're working in that root flare area, and it is a stressed tree. You can step in to build the defenses of the tree, at least temporarily, with soil-applied insecticides like your Zytect, Transtect, or Lepitect. These can be HTI soil-injected or soil-drenched. In the case of Lepitect, it's just an HTI application on the label. But Transtect and Zytect can both be just soil-drenched. You know, that would be very easy to do after you do an air spade type of soil loosening. Do a soil application of Zytect or Transtect if you need it, and then put the mulch on after that. Don't apply Zytect over the top of some mulch because it can bind to the organic matter and not get mobilized down into the roots as readily. So each one of these has its own rate of absorption, duration of effectiveness, and lists of insects it control. And it's another case of do this after the air spade work is completed, because you don't want to apply it and then do the air spade and blow it all over the place where it won't be as effective. So just to bring it back into a review, what we covered, the meaning of life, it's all about energy capture and energy release, and hopefully trees and whatever organism yourself, you're capturing more energy than you're releasing. If you're not doing that, then you're not going to stick around long. And we have to account for the respiration of trees' roots as well as their photosynthetic ability. So all of our different activities as arborists should be from that perspective. How are we physiologically benefiting those functions of a tree? What makes a good environment for those roots to function in? It's by far not what we typically get in an urban setting. And most tree problems that we deal with are stemming from the soil, really. Like by the time you see insect attack, a lot of times it is because there's stress due to soil factors. If you can get organic matter into the soil, you'll improve all the soil properties on the chemical, physical, and biological levels, increase nutrient availability, soil aggregation, porosity, water holding capacity, food for all the organisms that make a healthier soil environment. All that comes from organic matter if you can get that into the soil. And there are tools available to help improve those soil conditions. The air spade offers a huge opportunity to get into the soil, reduce compaction, check for girdling roots, and do all this without digging physically and damaging those tree roots. And along the way, as you're doing this, enroll the client in that conversation and the concepts of how they can be an ally in supporting the tree through cultural practices and the idea of the disease triangle, and that with all of our best practices, you don't save every tree, and it's a long road back sometimes on the ones that you do save. So expectation management of huge importance. So just develop some skill with that. It goes a long way. Now, wrapping up too, I just want to mention Saluting Branches is our national civic project. Arborists United for Veteran Remembrance. On September 23rd, 2015, we're spearheading a project to donate arborist time and resources to cleaning up trees in national cemeteries. And you can go to salutingbranches.org, and we're aiming for 22 cemeteries across the country and getting over 1,000 volunteers to pitch in efforts for doing tree pruning and cleanup of cemetery grounds. And you know, if you want to sign up as a volunteer, we're looking for site leaders, sponsorships, donations of money or food or labor. All of that is very welcome. So go, please check salutingbranches.org, and thank you for attending today. All right, I'm just looking at questions here. Prescriptions would be different based on soils and geographic locations. Are you able to share the different prescriptions? Oh, yeah, if you're talking about prescriptions of organic matter, that's basically, if we're looking at that POM 1, 2, and 3, it's for prescription organic matter 1, it's a 1 to 20 ratio. Like it's just straight up, like if you have 1 bucket of wood chips, then that goes to 20 buckets of compost. And then prescription organic matter 2 would be 1 bucket of chips to 10 buckets of compost. And if it's prescription organic matter 3, 1 bucket of wood chips to 2 buckets of compost. You know, so really quite a different ratio. But again, we're looking at, for that younger tree, much more direct access to nutrients and less carbon getting in the way. And when you want POM 3, you want more carbon, so it's going to be tying up more of those nutrients in the compost. You don't want a whole bunch of nutrients trying to push the growth on an older tree. So basically 1 to 20, 1 to 10, 1 to 2 ratio of chips and compost mixed in there. And beyond that, it's just based on your soil test results. Like, you have high pH, do you have a low particular micronutrient that you have to amend for? So hopefully, Dustin, that got your question answered there. And southern Indiana, from what I've seen of my travels throughout the country, you probably tend to have higher pH soils than we have here, and you can grow pin oaks like anything, where eastern pin oak tends to die out from chlorosis up in Minnesota. But I hope that addressed it for you, just kind of getting the ratios of carbon and compost in those different prescription organic matter levels. All right, well, if that's all the questions we have, we'll wrap up for today. And again, appreciate everyone's attention and attendance, and